Hi there. In a major announcement this week, George R. Martin revealed that a bioscience company he's donated to has genetically engineered dire wolves back from extinction. This is not a joke. This really happened. The direwolf pups were born on October 1st, and they just kept it a secret until now. Rather than, announce it, then turns out it's not viable, dies within a day. No, they did the right thing, which is wait a couple of months to make sure they're stable and healthy, then announce it. The first ones, which were born back on October 1st, were a pair of twins, who of course they named Romulus and Remus, which were followed in January by a female direwolf that they named Khaleesi. These new direwolves were engineered by company Colossal Biosciences, who are working on a variety of projects to de-extinct several species or save species on the verge of extinction. And George R. R. Martin has actually been a big wildlife conservation donor for years, funding wolf sanctuaries. So when he found out about this project, just as a natural extension, he contributed funding to them as well. So after the direwolf pups were born, because he was one of their major donors, they actually flew George out to do a photo shoot with them, holding them. And on top of that, these photos of the pups on the Iron Throne are not photoshopped in any way. They actually brought a prop Iron Throne to the sanctuary to put them on. Well, I say a prop, not the prop. There's more than one Iron Throne prop for different uses, and this was the one that they used for touring exhibitions around the world to promote Game of Thrones. And we knew that a couple of years ago the touring prop was sold at auction to the highest bidder, but it was an anonymous bidder, so we never knew where it went. Turns out that anonymous bidder was Peter Jackson of the Lord of the Rings films. He was the anonymous bidder who bought the Iron Throne prop. George explains this in the blog post, that it was Jackson who a year ago called him up and said, I think you'd be really interested in this because of your work with wolf conservation. They're trying to engineer back the dire wolf. So synergy here with Jackson and George promoting all of this. As of right now, the three current dire wolves are doing well. They are being held in an undisclosed nature reserve. They explained they're not releasing a location to the public for fear of, poachers or the press bothering them. That makes sense. They wouldn't publicize it. And even though they're off on their own there, they don't want the dire wolves to be breeding on their own. But thankfully, they gave them these contraceptive implants, chemical release, so they can't breed uncontrollably. That's good. One other note before I move on, though, matter of spelling, which is trivial, but the real life species is officially spelled as two separate words, dire and wolf. But for whatever reason, George R. R. Martin consistently spells it in his A Song of Ice and Fire novels as one word, direwolf. Just because it's cool, I don't know. Why is it that knights are called Sir, spelled S-E-R, instead of the real life S-I-R? That doesn't make sense, but you'll see the shift back and forth between real direwolves, it's spelled as two words. The fictional ones are one word. And on top of that, the fictional direwolves in the book are bigger than real direwolves ever were. I mean, they describe the ones in Westeros as an adult could be the size of a pony. I mean, obviously the Stark kids have juvenile ones. Even by the third book, they're still growing. But when they see the mother, they go, it's the size of a damn pony. Real direwolves were never that big. I mean, they were bigger than a gray wolf. But, there's the heightened world of fiction versus reality for the prehistoric animal. But in all seriousness, I want to go over the science behind this and the whole debate it's caused about whether these are really dire wolves. Can they, in fact, be called dire wolves or not? That you may have noticed I keep using terms like de-extincting or genetic engineering, but not cloning. These are not clones. Even Colossal says these are not cloned dire wolves. That cloning is specifically when you replicate the DNA of another organism. What Colossal did was to modify gray wolf DNA in such a way that it functionally produces the same chemical results as direwolf DNA. The issue is they didn't just splice direwolf DNA into a gray wolf or modify gray wolf DNA into direwolf DNA. It's not on the DNA level like that. They used different DNA to achieve the same end result. It's not a simple switch because direwolves aren't even in the same genus as gray wolves. I mean, we think they were more closely related to jackals. I I can't have this go on for an hour. I'd have too many other basic things, but the short, simplified version is they edited an unrelated gene to do the same thing. That imagine if gene number 10 in direwolves is the one that codes for shaggy fur. But for gray wolves, gene number 10, if it has defects in it, can result in blindness. So rather than mess with gene slot number 10, the unrelated gene number 20, they edit it in such a way that it codes for the same proteins and chemicals, end result, that direwolf ones do. Now, this isn't just that they bred a big gray wolf. They did sequence direwolf DNA to find the chemicals it codes for, but then used alternate DNA coding to reach the same end result, to pretty accurately imitate direwolf traits. This, of course, leads to the question, why didn't they just try to clone the direwolf, if they do have its sequenced DNA? Again, I regret, this is the short version. I'm trying to keep this shorter than an hour. Short version is that cloning is difficult enough with live animal species. You've seen all the failed results of that, and even when they do, they have a high washout level, they have lung problems. But when you're using recovered DNA, it's even worse. It's hard enough with live animals. With recovered DNA, it's inevitably going to be degraded, because just inherently, the DNA molecule naturally degrades over time if you leave it alone. Even if you freeze it or encase it in amber or whatever that means. No, it naturally degrades as a chemical. It doesn't just remain static, like half-life. And the problem is that DNA doesn't last remotely long enough to do something like clone a dinosaur. Dinosaurs lived 65 million years ago. At best, DNA only lasts about 1 million years, not 65 million years. That just due to natural decay, anything more than 1 million years old is totally unusable. Just degraded too much. It's slightly more plausible to try to clone back Ice Age megafauna, animals from 10,000 years ago instead of 1 million. It's still badly degraded, though. It's just, as opposed to utterly impossible and absurd, there's gaps all over the place. By comparison, you may have heard about this a couple of months ago. It was also by Colossal Biosciences. A couple of months ago, they announced that they're trying to de-extinct the woolly mammoth, and that they made woolly mice. But they didn't splice the woolly mammoth coat gene into mice. They manipulated unrelated mice genes to produce the same chemicals that give rise to woolly hair. I mean, when I keep saying chemicals as shorthand, I mean RNA, DNA to RNA to protein, the ribosome. You know all of this from high school biology. They made similar proteins from unrelated things. And you know what all this reminds me of? The debate around heck cattle. They're called heck cattle after the man who specifically bred them, but heck cattle, also known as man-killing Nazi cows, because they were created by the Nazis and bred for aggression. It was an attempt to recreate the aurochs, which actually also exists in Westeros. The aurochs is wild cattle. In real life, they went extinct in the 1600s. That the Nazis had this idea that after conquering the world, like ancient heroes of Germanic myth, they'd be wrestling aurochs by the horns with their bare hands, or more realistically, they'd be hunting aurochs for sport with guns and stuff. So they supported a project to recreate the aurochs through a process known as backbreeding. Backbreeding is really just a fancy term for intentionally breeding for recessive traits that resemble some other animal. No different than if you want a big dog, you breed big dogs together. If you want a brown dog, you breed two brown ones together until it breeds true. If you want this long, slinky dog that's meant to go down into foxholes, you breed increasingly narrow dogs together until you get the dachshund. That it doesn't, it's a new thing. It doesn't resemble something that came before. It has nothing to do with their genetic ancestry. Backbreeding is simply because an aurochs is bigger and overall has larger, pointier horns and is more aggressive than a regular cow. They just kept breeding big cows together and bred them for selective pressure for aggression until they got something. Their sole metric for this was externally it kind of looks like an aurochs. Theoretically, you could breed a dog into something that you could call vaguely aurochs-like, in the sense if you breed it big enough, you could eventually get something, well, it's the size of a cow. Yeah, but it's a dog. You just bred increasingly dogs with gigantism together until they got increasingly large in every generation. Not it feels like the genetic equivalent of a bonsai tree, that you're just selecting unrelated traits. So backbreeding, you're not recreating an animal, you are breeding an unrelated animal to vaguely resemble the outward appearance of another one. Chemically, they're not even remotely similar. What Colossal did with the direwolf is distinct from that. It is a bit more advanced than backbreeding with heck cattle, because they weren't just going by outside appearance, that they did sequence direwolf DNA, and they're trying to match the chemicals, biochemistry-wise. Even though they use different DNA to produce the same polymers, amino acids, and strands, it's the same chemical composition, so it's a little more internally like the biochemistry of a real direwolf. It is matching that, but they started from a different point. And on top of this, a major issue I'm not seeing a lot of news articles really addressing is behavior. Even if you straight up cloned, no degradation, if you cloned an animal, you can't clone learned behaviors, which many of the higher animals pass down from one generation to the next. There's an argument that it's culture. Whale songs. Different whales across the world, even of the same species, have different songs which are simply passed down by groups and are learned. So, one of the many extinct whale species, like the right whale, even if you cloned back the right whale, it wouldn't know any of the songs that are gone forever. They were wiped out. Like if an alien probe comes trying to talk to humpback whales, but the whales are extinct, you can't clone back a whale. You need to go and find an actual living humpback whale in the past, and it becomes a whole thing. You learn behaviors like that. This is all seen in the great apes. Dogs, to a lesser extent, I mean, it's not as intelligent as a dolphin, so nonetheless, wolves do have certain behaviors that if you raise one from birth away from other wolves in a zoo, there's certain passed on behaviors, or just teaching it how to hunt, that wouldn't be passed on as well. Now, these direwolf pups they made, that they said these are not raised among gray wolves, we raise them in isolation with each other as a family unit. Even so, how do we know barking behavior, not barking sound and pitch? I mean, their behavior might be very different from what a real ancient direwolf was like, because you can't clone back social patterns, learned behaviors between animals like that. But that's a whole other debate, because even if this was straight up cloning, which it isn't, cloning can never get that. None of this is to say that what Colossal did is insignificant. Oh, it's just the heck cattle backbreeding organ. No, this is a drastic advance in gene editing technology. It might not sound like a lot. They said we made 20 edits across 14 genes. Now, even 2 or 3 gene edits was considered a lot, like 20 years ago. So we're simultaneously doing 14 major ones that result in drastic changes to its appearance. This is a major step forward in gene editing. And I guess this is sort of the point of my video. I think what the critics are missing when they say this is just a publicity stunt is that Colossal is over there going, yes, it is a publicity stunt to promote our real work and our real measurable advances in gene editing technology, which could do real help for currently endangered species. And that's really been their primary goal. They talk about this a lot more in their Times article, but one of their main focuses is really helping the red wolf, which is pretty much extinct in the wild now. I think it was declared extinct in the wild around 1980. And even the ones in captivity, there are less than 300 red wolves still alive. When your numbers are knocked that low, you run into low genetic diversity. I mean, when you're down to there's only 40 white rhinos left a couple of years ago, they'll face horrific inbreeding. They won't be viable as a species, even if they're purely maintained in zoos, no limit to budget. Once you're below a certain number of the population, that threshold, you get inbreeding problems. So for some critically endangered animals, below 1,000, it's really too late for a lot of them, or severely harming them. What they explain they're doing is they're trying to reintroduce genetic diversity into surviving red wolves through genetic manipulation. Another thing they're doing, which is pretty clever, is before they went extinct, the red wolf frequently hybridized with the coyote, and they made coy wolves. That there's large parts of the wild coyote population have recessive red wolf genes in them. And they can tell by comparing it to a normal coyote genome. Okay, these are the parts that come from red wolf. And their goal is to take these lost red wolf genes that don't exist in any of the currently living red wolves and splice them back into the general population to make it more diverse. This is very plausible because it's working with living animals. You're not dealing with DNA degradation. So are these direwolves a gimmick? They're more of a mascot. Now, it's a publicity thing as a mascot for genetic editing. And it's really more about saving these other endangered animals than it is about de-extincting things. Yes, they do want to de-extinct a mammoth, but again, publicity for all the other work they're doing. I mean, they said they're going to start trying next year, but elephants have a really long gestation time of 2 years, so in around 2028, they expect to have this woolly mammoth born, even though it's really just a hairy elephant. The point is that we look what we can achieve with more advances in CRISPR gene editing technology. So you call it a gimmick, I call it a mascot. One thing that they're also working on, which actually, one of the few things you might be able to clone back, which is a deceased animal, is the thylacine, also known as the Tasmanian tiger or marsupial wolf. Because those didn't go extinct like 10,000 years ago. The last ones died in the 1930s in Australian Zoo. We even have footage of the thylacine before it died. It's very tragic. Just this deserves to be happy with other thylacines, and instead it's the last of their kind. That you could maybe kind of argue maybe we could try to clone this back or something. It's very hard. Colossal said they're trying to do that, trying to make a thylacine eventually, even though, it'll probably be like a really modified Tasmanian devil, and who knows if it'll be sustainable, but everything else I really dismiss out of hand as you can't clone back anything that lived before 1900, really. It's just not, there's too much damage. The real goal is getting to a point where if we can preserve and sequence live DNA from animals that are going extinct now, and save them for posterity. Like the last living white rhino, we should probably sequence its DNA while it's still alive before its DNA is degraded, and hope that in the future this knowledge will allow it to be brought back someday, compared to ancient animals that we physically can't sequence their DNA on. I don't know, but it's part of trying to preserve nature. And by the way, thylacines actually do exist in the world of Westeros. Just in the back, and they mentioned that Sirio Farrell says that the private zoo of the Sea Lord of Braavos has animals from all over the far corners of the world in it, one of which is a tiger that carries its cubs in its pouch. So it's not from Braavos, it's not from the Free City, he says from his far land, no one else had ever heard of this thing, so it must be from one of the far edges of the map, but thylacines still exist in their world. Maybe it's from like Olthos, the mysterious fourth continent at the far southeast of the map. Might be there, Australia, teeming with thylacines, we don't know. But it'd be fun if there's another series, different spin-off, where someone goes to Braavos And Aegon said he was going to Bravos last season. If as like a cameo, there's a CGI thylacine in a cage somewhere. Oh yeah, it's in my private zoo. It's from a different continent. Would be hilarious. So yes, these direwolves are really mascots, but for an important cause that is achieving real results. And I really hope that they let them cameo on one of the TV shows someday. One of the prequel shows where there's direwolves in the ancient north, like the Targaryen conquest. Not bring them to the show. I mean, have actors standing in a field, which in costume, which is really their nature preserve, and going, "Oh look, there's a direwolf in the Wolfswood. You hardly ever see direwolves anymore, Aegon, and Torrhen Stark, and everything." I think that'd be fun as a cameo of, "Oh, there's the quote unquote engineered direwolves." Would be fun.